What happens when a soldier walks into a room where no one remembers his name, except the one who owes him everything? And what if that room wasn't meant for heroes, but for judgment? The hearing room at Fort Harper wasn't much to look at. Wood-paneled walls, one flickering light overhead, and the distant sound of boots echoing down the hall. A small table sat in the center, flanked by 4 high-ranking officers. Their faces calm. Routine. A stack of papers sat unopened in front of the presiding general. Then the door opened. Slowly. Deliberately. Ray Elkwalker stepped inside. His gait was slow but unbroken. His jacket, faded olive, hung loosely over his shoulders. An old canvas medic's bag dangled from one hand, fingers curled around the strap like it held something sacred. No one stood. No salute. Just silence. He didn't look at anyone. Just walked to the center of the room, eyes focused ahead, as if he'd done this before. The clerk glanced at the folder, cleared his throat and read aloud. Case 22B, Ray Elkwalker. Unauthorized entry into restricted area. That's when it happened. General Caldon, seated at the head of the tribunal, froze. For a moment, he didn't blink. Then, slowly, he rose from his chair. His hand moved to his chest, not in formality, but as if steadying something that suddenly weighed more than his medals. He didn't speak. And the room, built for orders, built for rank and protocol, held its breath. Ray Elkwalker didn't belong to any rank anymore. He wore no insignia, carried no title. But when he stood in that room, there was something about his presence that made even polished boots shift slightly under the table. He was Navajo. Mid-60s, maybe older. Deep lines carved into his face, not from age, but from exposure, to sun, to wind, to loss. His eyes weren't defiant. Just watchful. Like a man who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Ray had no lawyer. No advocate. He hadn't requested one. His appearance at the military hearing wasn't combative, it was patient. Like someone who had waited years just to be allowed to stand and say nothing. The officers reviewed his file in silence. There wasn't much there. Discharge papers from decades ago. No commendations. No active duty since 1974. Just a handwritten note, faded and smudged, clipped to the back of the folder. One of the younger officers leaned over and whispered, "Is this guy even part of a current unit?" The clerk didn't answer. He just kept staring at Ray, as if trying to place a memory he couldn't quite reach. Ray stood at parade rest, but it didn't feel forced. It felt like breathing. Like muscle memory from a lifetime ago. No nameplate. No dress blues. Just a worn-out field jacket and a silence heavier than any accusation. When General Caldon finally spoke, he didn't ask Ray why he was there. He only asked, "Mr. Elkwalker, do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" Ray nodded once. And then said, calmly, "Yes, sir. I do. Nothing more. Nothing less." But enough to say this wasn't the first time he'd stood in a room like this, and it might not be the last. The incident at Fort Harper happened 3 weeks earlier. It was a quiet night, midweek, no scheduled drills, nothing unusual on the books. The base medical depot had been closed and locked since 1900 hours. By 2300, the motion sensors triggered. Security arrived within minutes and found a man crouched near the supply entrance, coat soaked through, hands trembling but not from fear. It was Ray Elkwalker. He wasn't armed. He hadn't broken anything. The door hadn't been forced. The outer gate, still under repair, had been left slightly ajar from earlier vehicle maintenance. Ray had slipped through without being seen. "What are you doing here?" one of the guards asked, flashlight aimed at his chest. Ray didn't raise his hands. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "Someone needed help." The guard squinted. "Help? From you?" Ray nodded, once. Then motioned to the canvas bag by his side. Inside were 3 bandages, a bottle of saline, and an old pressure cuff. Nothing dangerous, nothing stolen. "I wasn't trying to take supplies," Ray added. "I just needed enough to stop bleeding. That's all." There had been a scuffle outside base earlier that day. Civilian. Off-property. No official report was filed. But apparently, Ray had come across a young recruit off-duty, bloodied and dazed, wandering toward the fence line. He was just a kid, Ray told them. Didn't know what day it was. He'd gotten him stable. Enough to breathe. But by the time Ray made it to the depot, the medics were gone and the place locked up tight. "I've done this before," Ray said, when pressed. "Done what?" the sergeant asked. Ray looked down at his hands. "Stopped bleeding. On worse nights than this." He was detained immediately. Protocol demanded it. By morning, the report had landed on a desk higher than expected. General Caldon's office flagged it for review, not because of the supplies, but because of the name. There was no anger in the paperwork. No threats made. Just a line written in pencil by the security lead. Unarmed. Calm. Spoke clearly. Never raised his voice. Now, in the hearing room, the specifics of the incident were read aloud. Every detail. Ray stood and listened without interruption. He didn't defend himself. He didn't challenge the facts. When the reading ended, one officer leaned forward and asked, "Why not call the infirmary? Why not wait?" Ray looked him in the eye for the first time that morning. Because waiting takes time. And time's what that boy didn't have. No drama. No pride. Just the quiet certainty of someone who's done this kind of thing more times than he ever wanted to. And in that moment, the room understood something the report never said out loud. He wasn't trying to break rules. He was trying to save someone, again. General Caldon hadn't spoken again since the case file was read aloud. His posture, once rigid and composed, had changed. One hand rested gently on the edge of the desk, the other cupped beneath his chin. His eyes weren't on the papers anymore, they were locked on Ray Elkwalker. The room, though quiet, was beginning to shift. You could feel it in the breathing. In the way even the junior officers stopped taking notes. Finally, the general cleared his throat. It wasn't theatrical. It was the sound of a man preparing to speak carefully. Personally. "Elkwalker," he said. "Corporal. 2nd Recon. Vietnam. 1971. Ray didn't move. General Caldon looked down at the papers, then back at him. "Do you remember Firebase Echo?" he asked. Ray blinked slowly. "Yes, sir. I do." The general leaned back in his chair. The lines on his face tightened. His jaw worked once, then stilled. "I was 19, he said. PFC, we were cut off for 2 nights. Our comms were dead. We had 2 wounded and no medevac in range." He looked at the others seated at the table, his voice quieter now. "We'd started to believe help wasn't coming." Then he turned back to Ray. "But he came. Elkwalker came. Crawled in through jungle and mortar fire. Pulled us out one at a time. Didn't say a word. Just motioned. Moved. came back again. Ray remained silent. Not from pride. Just stillness. One of the officers broke the silence. "Sir, is this on record?" General Caldon shook his head. "No. Because no one knew who brought us out. He vanished the next day." He looked straight at Ray. "I didn't know your name. Until today." The weight of the room changed. What was once protocol had become something else. Something older. More human. The young officer who had doubted Ray earlier leaned forward slightly, brows furrowed. "You saved the general's life?" Ray didn't nod. Didn't confirm. He just said, "Wasn't about saving a general. It was about bringing men home." No one spoke for a moment. Then the general stood. No command. No gesture. He simply rose to his feet. His arms at his side. Head bowed ever so slightly. It wasn't a salute. Not yet. But it was something close. Something reverent. The others followed, first uncertain, then sure. Chairs pushed back softly. Boots scraped the floor. One by one, they stood. Ray didn't look around. He stayed centered, eyes forward, as if the moment wasn't about him. Because to him, it wasn't. He had done what he was trained to do. Then stepped away. But now, for the first time in years, the name Elkwalker was no longer spoken like a file number. It was remembered like a name carried out of fire. Quietly. Fully. With both hands. After the room had settled, the officers resumed their seats, though not one of them looked quite the same. The formality had cracked. Something more personal had crept into the space. General Caldon remained standing for a moment longer before easing back into his chair. His tone, when he spoke again, had changed. It no longer carried the clipped edge of command, but the measured weight of reflection. "I'd like to submit a personal statement," he said. "For the record." There were no objections. He placed a small envelope on the table. Inside were 4 letters. Handwritten. Each one signed by a different man. Different units. Different years. These came in over the past 48 hours, he explained. None of these men knew each other. But when they heard the name Ray Elkwalker listed on the preliminary charge docket, they reached out. On their own. The clerk opened the first and read aloud. "To whom it may concern. In 1972, I was wounded in Cambodia. Officially, I was listed as missing for 20 hours. What wasn't in the report was that someone dragged me through a rice field under fire and whispered the Lord's Prayer in Navajo the whole way. I never saw his face again. Until I saw his name on a list last week." There was a pause. The air seemed heavier. The second letter told of a young medic pinned beneath rubble during a rescue op in 1983. He'd nearly bled out when an older man, quiet as shadow, pulled me clear and left before anyone could ask who he was. Another letter. Another account. Each one the same shape, a quiet appearance, a life saved, then silence. General Caldon tapped the table gently. "There are no official commendations for these. No citations. Because no one knew who to thank." He turned to Ray. "You never told them it was you." Ray met his gaze. "It wasn't important." "Why?" one of the officers asked. "You could have earned silver stars, even a Distinguished Service Cross. You could have been recognized." Ray's answer came slowly. "Because if I spoke up, the story would have been about me. But it wasn't. It was about getting them out. That was the point. One of the younger officers, still new to the gravity of such moments, asked, "So you've done this, what, how many times?" Ray shrugged. "Enough." Silence followed. Not out of disbelief. Out of understanding. Because everyone in that room now knew they were sitting across from a man whose valor had never been written down, not because it didn't happen, but because he chose not to write it. Unrecorded valor. It's a strange kind of bravery. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that walks away before the applause can start. And for the first time in a long time, Ray Elkwalker's story began to surface, not through his own words, but through the quiet voices of those he'd once carried through the dark. The room had grown still again. Not from silence, but from the kind of quiet that comes when truth is close. Ray Elkwalker remained at attention, his expression unchanged. But something in his posture had softened. Just enough for the officers to notice. General Caldon leaned forward. "Ray," he said, "not Corporal, not Mr. Elkwalker. Just Ray. This part isn't in the file. But I need to ask. Why did you return to the base that night? Why not go through command? Why risk walking in alone?" Ray took a long breath. "There was a boy," he said quietly. "Not much older than 20. I found him slumped behind the mess hall. Looked like he'd been in a fight, maybe off post. Head was bleeding. Breathing was shallow." He paused. He was wearing the insignia of Echo Unit. 3rd Battalion. General Caldon blinked. "That's our active unit." Ray nodded. "I know. My son wore the same." The weight of the room shifted. The officers straightened. General Caldon didn't speak. Ray continued. "Isaiah. That was his name. Joined the Corps the moment he turned 18. Didn't ask me for advice. Just went. Fallujah, 2004. There was no anger in his voice. Just memory. He was reported missing after an ambush. They never recovered the body. Just fragments. Dog tags were melted. They sent me what they could. I buried a box and saluted it like it was whole." He looked down, for the first time since the hearing began. "I didn't talk about it. Not to anyone. I stayed near the bases, lived quiet, listened for stories. Just in case. I always thought, maybe one day I'd hear different news." One of the junior officers shifted in his seat. His voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "You thought the boy you found might have been your son?" Ray didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "I knew it wasn't him. But he wore the same unit. Same age. Same eyes. And for a second, it didn't matter. It was someone's son. Someone's boy who wasn't gonna make it through the night without help." There was a long pause. The kind that doesn't need filling. Then he added, even softer, "Sometimes helping someone else's child is the only way you can keep honoring your own." No one spoke. No one looked away. Because in that moment, it was clear, the charge, the hearing, the regulation, none of it held more truth than the quiet grief Ray Elkwalker carried every day. Not in protest. But in love. There was a moment of hushed conversation among the officers. Papers shuffled. A nod from General Caldon. Then the clerk reached beneath the table and pulled out a small velvet box, blue, lined with gold trim, the kind reserved for medals not often handed out. The general stood once more and held the box in both hands. Not like an award. Like an offering. "Corporal Ray Elkwalker," he said, voice measured but carrying weight. For acts of extraordinary valor performed without recognition, and for continued service in defense of life beyond the call of duty, this tribunal recommends formal reinstatement of your previous commendation and elevation to Silver Star status. He stepped forward, box extended. Ray didn't move. He looked at the box, not with surprise, but with a sadness that ran deep. "I've seen that box before," he said quietly. "And I've watched too many men open one for someone who never made it home." The general waited. Ray's hand didn't reach out. "I'm not refusing because I'm bitter," he continued. "I'm refusing because there are too many names that aren't written on citations. Too many hands that never got a medal." He looked the general in the eye. "If I take it now, after all this time, it won't be for them. It'll be for your peace of mind." There was no accusation in his voice. Just honesty. A quiet line drawn between honor and symbolism. General Caldon lowered the box. Ray nodded once, like an unspoken salute. "Some things," he said, "aren't meant to be worn on the chest. They're meant to be carried." No applause followed. No ceremony. Just a shared stillness between men who understood what dignity looked like when it had nothing left to prove. The box was returned to the table, unopened. And Ray Elkwalker remained just as he had been when he walked in, unadorned, unclaimed, and unshaken. When the hearing concluded, no one rushed to leave. No chairs scraped. No boots echoed. The air inside the tribunal room had changed, not from verdict, but from the weight of everything that had been said without needing to be shouted. Ray Elkwalker gathered his canvas bag without urgency. His movements were slow, deliberate, and quiet. Just like his presence. He didn't ask if he was free to go. He didn't wait for orders. He simply nodded to the clerk, then turned toward the door. Halfway there, he paused. Not because someone called out, but because he felt it. General Caldon had risen from his chair. Not with command, but with reverence. He stepped forward, stopping just short of Ray's path. No words. No ceremony. He squared his posture, straightened his coat, and raised his right hand in a full, formal salute. The kind of salute that's not about regulation. The kind that's given from one soldier to another, not for rank, but for something earned in silence. Ray didn't return it. Not because he didn't respect it, but because he didn't need to. He simply held the general's gaze, nodded once, and kept walking. The salute stayed in the air a moment longer, held by something older than policy. Then Caldon lowered his arm. Outside, the base was quiet. The afternoon sun had begun to fall behind the barracks, casting long, amber-colored shadows on the pavement. Ray walked without a destination. And though the gate guard didn't know who he was, he stood a little taller as Ray passed. Because sometimes, a man leaves the room without saying a single word. And still takes everyone's silence with him. Some heroes never wear their medals. Some never speak of what they've done. Ray Elkwalker walked into a military hearing with nothing but a canvas bag and a quiet sense of purpose. He left without a ribbon, without a speech, yet changed the hearts of every officer in that room. His story reminds us that true valor doesn't seek credit. It simply acts. Not once, but again and again, quietly, without asking to be seen. Through every part of this story, from a life saved behind the barracks to a general's silent salute, we are reminded of the power of humility and the weight of sacrifice that goes unnoticed. Ray didn't refuse the medal out of pride, he refused it out of principle. Because some honors are meant to be carried, not displayed. In a world that often confuses recognition with worth, Ray showed us what dignity really looks like. How many Ray Elkwalkers have we forgotten? How many silent sacrifices have gone unspoken? If this story moved you, If it reminded you of someone you know, or someone we all owe, please like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because some stories don't need to be loud to echo forever.